Another episode of Catch Up to Contenders, and this time we are covering the Pacific region. Yes, it is a quagmire of various different nationalities pushed together. There's people from Australia, Taiwan, Thailand, where else? Japan, Korea. It's a it's actually probably got the most nationalities out of any of the regions. I don't know. Am I right in saying that? It just struck me there that that might be
Yeah.
true.
I think Europe might have more.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, yeah,
Technically.
yeah. Yeah, but I
But-
think of
and-
Europe
yeah.
as just this conglomerate glob, It's they're all the
Let's
same.
add in Hong Kong and Singapore in there as well.
Of course.
Taiwan,
yes.
of course.
Yeah, there's a big
Suddenly-
range. Okay, so
That's
I've brought in the
nationality.
experts. I've brought in Pixie and Avril, the duo that have covered Pacific region for pretty much as long as it's existed, right? Was there any Pacific
Yep.
tournament that you didn't cover?
Like some minor ones way back in the day.
The stuff
Yeah.
before Pacific Championship, so
Yeah,
before
but as soon
the
as it went
really
big.
stuff.
As soon as it went big, you two were the boys. So, and also familiar with the Australian scene as well, which will be interesting. So, what I've actually got up on the screen right now. Normally, I have like the table or the playoff picture of the tournament that we're actually going to talk about, Contenders. But I'm going to hit people with the confusing beginning right off the bat because what I've got on the screen. Oh no, actually, shit. No, I do actually have the right thing on the screen. But what I was going to have on the screen is the Pacific Championship, which was the big tournament that ran at the same time as like OWPS and the way back like the first season of Contenders in Europe and North America, which is what I was really familiar with, watched quite a lot of it, but haven't kept up with the Pacific scene as much. And at that time, we had a Korean team called Ardiant that were absolutely dominating everywhere. A lot of them have moved over to Lucky Future Zenith and continue to dominate in China, although a couple of them have moved on to stuff like the Overwatch League. And then you had Blank from Australia, and you had Flash Wolves, which were a Taiwanese team. And so, can you explain to me some of the storylines that have happened throughout the 2 seasons of Pacific Contenders from then up until now?
Well, if you don't mind me taking this one,
I do mind, but go ahead.
Well, too bad. I think there's 3 major things that I see as being relevant to not just that second season of OPC, but also the first one as well. At the end of that second season, of OPC, 2 of the major Taiwanese organizations kind of stepped away from Overwatch altogether, those being Flash Wolves and AHQ. When you consider that before that point, Taiwan was the most represented nation, both in terms of organizations and number of players, that was actually quite a significant shift and opened up the region a little bit to some newer teams. Like you go back to season 1 of OPC, you had, I believe it was 3 from Taiwan. You had the 1 Australian team, you had a Thai team in Fireball, you had 2 Japanese teams, and then Hong Kong Attitude were sort of somewhat mixed. So like, it was actually not many nations, and I bring that up because you actually talked about that just a moment ago. Like now, it's actually one of the, in my opinion, unique points of the region is that there are a lot of different nations and a lot of mixed representation in that regard, which I think is quite cool. So that was quite a significant shift. And also it's in those 2 seasons of OPC and then following on into the season of Contenders, season 1, where Japan kind of earned its unfortunate reputation that is now finally being undone. So that's kind of set the stage for what we've seen now in season 2. And then there's kind of a final note to that, which is just, I mean, the fact that there is now an amount of longevity in our Contenders region that does somewhat exist in the other regions, but in a quite different format. Like it is very clear cut that Contenders is, at least in Pacific, kind of a spiritual successor to OPC, or perhaps that OPC is like a spiritual predecessor to Contenders, which was inevitably going to launch in the region. So it's far more easy to see the contiguous link with these teams. It's not been, split across multiple tournaments, and then with Overwatch League signings halfway through the middle of it. So when you look on teams like Mega, who've existed since like the very first season of OPC, and then same again with Blank, same again with Matchy, Hong Kong Attitude. There's a longevity that exists there that has storied these teams as others have come and gone in a way that I think a lot of other regions don't quite have.
Yeah, before Contenders, a lot of the other regions were running smaller standalone tournaments that were like elimination format, right? And really, it was OPC and OWPS and that's the Chinese one for anyone who's unfamiliar, that had this long form format that was very similar to what Contenders then became. Trialing these four game formats and the crazy best of 7 finals over the course of many matches. So yeah, I like that you can tie together all of these storylines.
You can also say I would put Apex somewhere in that boat as well. Like these were the kind of long form tournaments at the time, and before Pacific Championship, it was basically like you said, it was almost these kind of very short tournaments and kind of almost amateur as well. They didn't have a lot to it. It was just a bunch of amateur teams playing, and this is where kind of Hong Kong Attitude and Blank were formed in, right? Because these were the teams that back in the day didn't really have organization to play under. And as soon as the OPC came around, the Pacific Championship for the first season, it was kind of in response to like the Pacific version of Apex or the Pacific version of the Overwatch Premier Series in China. So you had these amateur teams being picked up by big organizations across, the Pacific region, like Flash Rolls and AHQ coming in, picking up most of the best Taiwanese players, Blank coming in to push the Australian team into the Pacific region, where the predecessor team, which was called Fusion Girls at the time, were basically competing in Taiwanese tournaments anyway. So they'd been competing in these amateur tournaments and actually winning. There were like 5 of them. They were called Los Muertos Cup, and Blank won, if I'm not incorrect here, all 5 of them, every single tournament on high ping. And this is before Flash Rolls became a team. Flash Rolls was kind of like 2 separate teams, and then the best members got put together under the Flash Wolves banner, and then they started to do really well. And so across the first OPC, I mean, that was like an invitational tournament to say, let's put all the best teams across the Pacific region, or at least all the ones that we know about and that we're happy with and that we know are going to be happy to play here, because it was also a 13-week LAN tournament.
Yeah, quite grueling.
You talk about long form. I mean, it's like, I believe it's still to date the longest tournament to date across all of Overwatch. Someone could correct me if I'm wrong, but
yeah, it was 4 round robins.
4 round robins, and then what we saw in the Overwatch League playoffs with the sort of best of 3, best of 5s, where you had to play multiple days of best of 5s. That was how the playoff structure kind of worked in the original Pacific Championship as well. The grand finals was actually best of 3, best of 7, so you had to win 2 best of 7s out of 3 days.
That was nuts.
So there was a decent amount of trial, I think, with that tournament, because there's also the home and away game. So there's a lot of stuff that was introduced into the OPC, which wasn't really the case yet for any other tournaments, like the massive formats and then home and away and all that kind of stuff going on.
Now it really seems like they were trialing concepts for the Overwatch League as well in the OPC. But something really interesting that you've brought up with Blank Esports previously winning on high ping and then it being an invitational tournament with it all being at LAN, because as we moved into Contenders, I'm right in saying that it all went back online, right?
Yeah.
The first season was still LAN, but this season
right, okay.
is online.
And that presumably has made a large difference for a lot of these teams, because the Pacific region is not known for, first of all, a great internet structure in a lot of places, and secondly, for having like the smallest distances between everybody. If you've got teams that are in Korea and Singapore and Hong Kong and then Australia, these are some massive distances to cover.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the reality is it is a factor, and there's no getting around that. And it does just add in like another layer of challenge. It's not the end all be all as well, though. Like, I think that's something that people should really remember when they're watching it. Like, you've got you've got 2 Thai teams, one that bottomed out, one that made semifinals. Like, they're on the same ping. So, Mega didn't lose now because they've got high ping when previously they're on LAN. Like, that's not how it works. Same with CAG. They're from Japan. They've got significantly higher ping than, say, the Korean teams, one of which they beat in their quarterfinal. And I have to say, there's actually this sort of surprise blessing part to it as well. And this is something that actually only occurred to me a couple of days ago. In the past, we would actually have teams, at least we had this in season 1 of Contenders, we had teams qualify for that season of Contenders that then couldn't actually play in it because it was on LAN and they couldn't get to the LAN environment. They didn't have the funds to get to the LAN environment, which meant that you didn't necessarily, and I kind of hate to make this sound so cut and dry, but you didn't necessarily have like the best teams from the region playing in that Contenders tournament. So going into online, it's like it has introduced other challenges, especially for the countries further and further away from Taiwan, which is the server where the maps are played. But you do actually at least get those teams in. Like Cyclops Athlete Gaming, if I'm not mistaken, did actually qualify for season 1 of Contenders, couldn't play in it. And now that they can, guess what? They're like a top team in it. So we actually do genuinely have the highest level of teams that can possibly play in this tournament, currently playing in this tournament. And it means when a new team emerges into this tournament, it's because they are like a new good team at that level.
Just to dive into the nitty-gritty a tiny little bit more, do you know what the various pings are from Taiwan for these teams so that we can kind of
I'll
have
give
some
context
idea?
on that. It's much better for Japan, so I'd probably disagree and say Japan have a very good ping to Taiwan, which has definitely contributed to the success. I know blank play anywhere between 160 to 200, and the Thai teams, Mega in particular, would be somewhere in that range, maybe slightly better. Which is interesting because there are 2 Thai teams, one that did significantly better. So I think there's a lot to be said for Xavier Esports, who, despite the disadvantages, had a very good job.
Yeah,
Did a very good job, rather. All the Korean pings will be sub 100. I think the worst ones will be, on the higher end, closer to 100, but they're all below 100. There'll be no one realistically playing above that. And then you have teams that are located in Taiwan, as well as players from certain teams located in Taiwan, like Machi Esports, which is a full Korean team, had 2 of their Korean players in Taiwan at the time. So they've obviously got some pretty good ping, and then sort of from everywhere else, it's somewhere in that mix. But Australia and Thailand definitely kind of had the worst. And the other thing to mention is when you think about the original competitions, and okay, well, Fusion Girls won a bunch of tournaments on high ping, but that was also before professional play was really cemented in the region. I mean, that's a bunch of amateur teams. If you're miles above and miles ahead of other teams at the time, which Fusion Girls kind of were, the original blank, that's kind of what happens. But after you're a year plus deep, you're nearly 2 years deep now, and teams are far more practiced, teams are very professional, teams have been playing full-time for a long time. If you are on high ping now, it's a lot more punishing than it used to be.
Absolutely. All right, let's dive back into the history again, because 2 teams that have really interested me as they've gone through. As I said, Ardiont no longer really present in the region. I don't think any of their players actually continue playing in the region, right? 2 of them,
No.
2 of them went to the Overwatch League. The rest of them went to Lucky Future Zenith. Republic has apparently disappeared into the ether. I have no idea what happened to that guy. I really actually liked him on main tank, but he appears to have just disappeared. I don't know what's happened.
Smurf went to NA Contenders.
Yeah.
GGEA.
Okay, so the team that I'm really interested in, actually, though, is the Taiwanese team Flash Wolves. Because as you said, organizations disappeared from the league. But I would have expected some of these guys, like Bacon Jack, for example, who looked really good, to have carried on playing in some capacity. Do you know what happened to this team? Because they were second in the Pacific Championship.
I'll take this one. And this kind of happened around the same time that PUBG kind of really took hold in Asia, like across all the Asian countries. And so there was a lot of, it was quite difficult for, I think, the Overwatch scene across both China and the Pacific region. I'd probably say Korea in some ways as well, not necessarily as heavily, but you had players definitely leaving the Overwatch scene from Korea to
Long live Eska.
Evermore, I don't know, guys like that. So it was kind of during that time, and also the fact that Overwatch was starting to become, for a lot of these organizations, less and less viable in their words. And if you kind of look at the recent drama, that it's still recent enough with Envision and their owner sort of getting out of Contenders and then being bought up by Envy and all that kind of stuff. It's a very similar kind of story where the owners didn't feel like the money they were being thrown in was kind of justified at the time. And I wouldn't say that they're out forever, but certainly during the time and where it is now. And this was, by the way, under the context of Overwatch Pacific Championship having like a 6-figure prize pool, nearly 300,000 US, by the way, and Flash Wolves coming in first or in one season, and second the other season, claiming a large chunk of that. And the organization still felt like it just wasn't like viable, sustainable enough for them, so they kind of took off. And then the players, after losing the organization, kind of felt a bit disgruntled as well in terms of in some ways. And then you have the shiny new game coming in, and they're thinking, oh, this is the new thing, this is the new esport for me, and I'm pretty good at this. I'm okay. I'm pretty good at Overwatch also, but let's give this a shot and see what happens. And unfortunately, because of that, you have the case where superstar players like Bacon Jack, who realistically could have had a shot at something like the Overwatch League. He was probably one of the best players in Pacific history still to date, I'd say. And this is widely, it's not just even my opinion, this is widely agreed upon by the players that played against him, with him. You had a team, Ardian, who absolutely dominated, and Bacon Jack was probably the only outlier. He never got dominated. His team did, but he didn't. So.
And then if we continue through to Contenders, a really interesting team, I think, for a lot of people looking in from a Western perspective, will be Blank Esports, because they were so dominant at the beginning of it. Sorry. And then couldn't quite live up to their potential. Got beaten by Flash Wolves. They obviously got spanked around by Ardion as well. But this is a team that I think a lot of people are interested in Australia as a region because it's very easy to plug these guys into North American, European teams if they're English speaking. And therefore, it's kind of like a cool region to keep an eye on if you have little glimmers of awesome talent there. But Blank Esports appear to have been having some difficulties here. Is it just a ping? What's happening with them this season? Because if we bring up their current performance in the group stage, it wasn't particularly impressive.
It's a variety of factors. Well, I want to touch on a couple of things, and then I'll imagine you probably have a couple of things you want to bring up as well. Because, like, let's be honest, the ping actually is a factor. And I think Avril made quite a good point before. Like, this is a team that used to win even on this sort of ping, but since then, all the other teams in the region that they are liable to be playing against have also themselves got better and are almost entirely all on better ping. So it is a factor. There's no two ways about that. And it's like, I would say it's why, like, it's the strength of this team that they still made it into the playoffs, and maybe it's the damage of the ping that they only made it into the quarters and didn't go any further. Like, when you compare that to maybe someone like Mega, who struggled with ping and then a host of other issues, like with how the team was playing, and they completely bottomed out of their group. So, like, that's kind of the point of comparison I want to draw there. Blank also suffered from a couple of other issues. After the second week, they did lose Huwu, who is an incredibly talented player, quite a young guy as well, and like the only New Zealand representative. So rip us. Losing him, I think, was a bit of a tough blow, because after that, you look at who they went throughout the rest of the tournament. They had 1 week with Kiki, who was their previous flex tank player back in the first season of OPC as Blank. Then they went, they had a fella called Pekka for 1 week, and then for the final week of play and then the quarterfinals, they had a dude called Dragon Breath. So they never actually had like one person that they just plugged into that role for the rest of the season. And they're still a good team, and these players were still decent players, but just that extra little bit of chopping and changing and not really have any kind of contiguous thing. Like, you're spending a week just trying to get this person like gelled into your roster as it exists, while also trying to fix the things that have been going wrong and keep up in the kind of arms race that starts happening as teams approach playoffs. It was always going to be like nigh insurmountable. And you add stuff like ping on top of that. The reality is they had like issues with their play right from the start of the season. They just weren't quite at their usual level, I would say. And I think, Avril, you could probably give a bit more detail on that. But then there's just a bunch of other things that happened that I think made it a bit too much of a mountain to climb. We never at any point ruled them out, because this is always a team that like can just, you know, crunch time comes and then, hey, look, there they are. That happened in season 1 of OPC. They struggled throughout the middle of the season and then came back to make it to the grand finals. They kind of hit their stride once again. But also, it wasn't surprising when they went out in the quarters.
And, you know, for this team as well, like, it's difficult sometimes because you end up kind of sounding like you're making a bunch of excuses for them. But, I mean, the thing is, if you look at their history, they've never been out of the top 4, I believe. In fact, even the top 3, second place in OPC Season 1, third place OPC Season 2, second place in the last season of Contenders. That's just in the Pacific region. They've also played an APAC Premier where they came 5th to 8th, right? So we know they're a very good team, but these are all tournaments where they have played on LAN. I think because of specifically their location, you look on a map, Australia is the most far away country from Taiwan, from the Pacific
everything,
region possible.
from civilization.
So, yeah, I guess pretty much. I
That's
mean,
it. It's just six dudes in the middle of the outback playing Overwatch.
And that's the other thing. The other thing people forget is it's not just okay. So there's a logistical difference here. Australia is just literally further away than every other country to where Pacific is. But also on top of that, Australia is kind of notorious for having bad internet. Like we live in New Zealand, and New Zealand has fantastic internet compared to definitely Australia.
really?
Our internet is really, really good.
Yeah.
Australia's internet is god awful. It is. If you talk to Australian people who are currently living there, you ask them about how good their internet is, it is truly, truly bad.
Yeah. 5 years ago, the two nations were actually about the same. New Zealand did a real infrastructure push, especially with fiber. Australia had it promised, and it's just never materialized. And like, I'll be honest, like the esports industry has always grown there, and that's been great. But it's also suffered a little bit for that. Like, for any game where players can't consistently be playing in more LAN environments, or like you're the one guy on your team that doesn't have fiber, like sometimes it can just be a bit too insurmountable, and it has kind of hurt them in some ways.
So there's all of those factors, and I think them all living apart. Notice that also a number of teams, and I'm not going to be able to confirm this, but it's probably quite strong speculation anyway. A number of teams in Contenders right now in the Pacific region may be playing in team houses together, maybe a lot closer, especially if you're your Korean team. There's a good chance you're all in Seoul, so you can actually just get together and play. And there's professional teams where you're definitely in a team house together, like guys. I'm pretty sure Hong Kong Attitude would definitely fit the bill onto that one. And you look at Blank Esports, and unfortunately for them, they're kind of reasonably spread out over Australia as well. Their coach lives in NA, so there's a bunch of things that are just not really working out for them this season, and I'm fairly confident that if they were playing on LAN, they'd have much better results now. Good enough results to make it past the quarterfinals and back in the grand finals. We'll have to see, but definitely much better than fourth place in their group, nearly being relegated.
Yeah.
It looks like they made some fairly significant roster changes as well. A player that I'm disappointed not to see around on pretty much any roster, as far as I can tell, is I Eat You Up as well, who seemed like, in some ways, like the Australian Bacon Jack. They always seem to be very close to each other. What happened to that guy?
So there's been no real confirmation. There's been no like kind of announcements made or anything like that. He kind of just disappeared at the start of the season. But he is currently LFT, so he's looking for a team. But I believe, if I'm not mistaken, he's based in China. That I could be wrong about that. He could actually be back in Australia. But last I heard, he was based in China. Between seasons, he would go to China for a decent amount of time, and he wouldn't actually be in Australia with the rest of the guys. So after last season, everyone kind of went home to Australia and continued playing as a team, and I believe he remained in China. That's as far as my knowledge goes on his current whereabouts, but he is LFT as well. So maybe something went on internally there where he didn't felt like he wanted to play with that team anymore. Maybe he wanted to change regions, which would probably make sense for him as well. But otherwise, yeah, he's just kind of still existing, but waiting to get started.
There could still be like a potential future that exists for this guy, because I think you're definitely not alone, Sideshow, and like having eyes on this guy. It would, like, you wouldn't be remiss to refer to him as like the Australian Bacon Jack in one regard. Like there was really a time where it did feel like this was the only guy that ever could take it to Bacon Jack in like the old Tracer v Tracer situations. So yeah, like maybe this guy is going to pop up again like next season of Contenders or sometime next year on a team, like maybe one out of Australia, maybe one in Pacific, maybe a Chinese team. Like we really just don't know. Just all that we know for now, he's not on the team. There's no official statement as to why, and he is looking for team.
And then they lost Gumber over to the LA Valiant, where he's been performing pretty well as the analyst over there. Spoken to Big Daddy Coach Moon, and he has high regards for Gunber. And RQT as well. So when you look at the Blank Esports roster on paper, can you give me a feel for like how good these guys are, the strengths of the team? What changes from the previous roster have they made that's affected either the style or the strengths?
Let's talk about that backline first. You mentioned Gumber and RQT, so they were of that original Blank squad. RQT being the captain and Gumber being, maybe co-captain and the leader in various ways as well. They had the most kind of impact on how the team was because they were the leadership duo, in-game, out-of-game, everything. Basically, when you played the game, it was, they were steering the wheel. So losing them definitely shifted the way Blank were in pretty high regards. So the next most veteran players at the time ended up being Trill and IU Up. So you had to had to kind of pass the torch over and see how those guys could kind of lead the team. And right now, there's no new captain specifically for Blank, but I believe that Trill is kind of de facto in that role. He might not really admit it, but let's face the facts. Right now, as of today, as of the season, he is the most veteran player on the squad, bar none. So in my eyes, he's de facto captain. I think in terms of player respect, every other player respects him the most because he's been there the entire time through all the tough times and the good times through thick and thin. But I think they had to really make that shift between losing Gumber and RQT to what their current form is. And then on top of that, they've also brought in new players across different various roles, support, tank, and also DPS. Who Pixie mentioned earlier, has been a really big deal for Blank, and he's been one of their best players. So losing him unexpectedly this season definitely hurt them as well. And you can sort of see the impact that guys like Gumber had. Like you said, Josh, he went to an LA Valiant. And I think the interesting trivia there is that Coach Moon was the coach of Ardiant. He's like the head coach of Ardiant.
Yes, yeah,
so
yeah.
Gumber played against his team. So now they're on the same team together, which I find like a nice twist of things happening.
So they've garnered some respect in that
actually,
tournament.
all three of the Ardiant coaches are actually now in Overwatch League. NYXL, Shanghai Dragons, and LA Valiant. And Gumber's now with them as I believe either the analyst or assistant coach or something. And now he's sort of coming back. Both RQT and Gumber are coming back for the World Cup for Australia. So that'll be really interesting to see.
I also want to jump in with a note there as well, because like you sort of touched on this a little bit, but there's sort of a bit more detail I feel is worth mentioning here. Like when you look back in the days when they were Fusion Girls and like the earliest days of their dominance, both in Australia and then as they started looking outwards, like this is in the time that like predates team infrastructure basically in the Pacific region. So also between like Gunba and RQT, not only were they handling like the captaincy side of things, they're also handling a lot of what would now be, you know, duties split up between like analysts and coaches and all that kind of stuff. So also their departure from the team, in my opinion, marks a pretty significant shift fully from Blank being like once upon a time being fully reliant on folks like Gunber and I mean realistically just the players themselves to handle like analyzing their own stuff and like being their own coaches, to this kind of transitionary period where they were still on the team, but then there was also some coaching infrastructure like throughout the course of OPC, to their departure and the sort of the hard shift to being like basically having those coach and analyst duties handled more or less dedicated by a coach and analyst. Like it is still a relatively collaborative thing, all things considered, but like that is quite a significant shift that I think the team has made over the course of that time. And I think it is a positive one. That isn't to say anything ill of Gunba and RQT, but like everyone knows that the way a good professional esports team in any game works is you have the players and then you have like the coaching staff, which includes, you know, maybe your analysts, could even include people like sports psychologists theoretically. And then you've got like whatever management staff are in place. And like the more stratified and the more compartmentalized that is, the better, because it means each individual part could focus on just their thing. We know how hard it is for teams that are their own coaches and their own managers and their own business representatives to thrive in tournaments where all the other teams have that full infrastructure. So that being a shift that Blank has made, I think has really helped the team in one regard across that time. And I think is why for a year and a half, they continued to remain quite dominant in the Pacific region, or at least like top 3, 4 in the Pacific region, while those other teams were also catching up in their own right.
Now I know that you two have been keeping up with the Australian region. You're right there. You're practically sat on its doorstep. Is to set the context a little bit? Blank were easily the best Australian team. And even when they moved away and other Australian teams started doing really well, and there seemed to be a bit of a question mark, for the previous World Cup, when teams were being tested against each other, the end result of that testing seemed to come down fairly favorably on, yes, Blank is still, if not head and shoulders, they are still the best team that Australia would be able to provide. At this point in time, with the rise of teams like Sydney Drop Bears and Dark-Sided, I think, are doing pretty well, right? What is your feel for how Blank would mesh into the Australian scene. Are these guys still head and shoulders the best team that Australia would be able to provide? Are they the best players that they would be able to provide?
Short answer is yes. Long answer would be, let's bring into context that Blank, because they're currently in Australia, they're actually scrimming Australian teams. Again, that is reasonably good practice for them now. Two parts. One, because of the fact that, on local ping, it's much, healthier practice. On the second part of that is because, like you said, the teams in Australia have really caught up in many ways, so they're much better competition for Blank. But that's still kind of just what they are to Blank now. Is, they're good competition, they're good scrimming partners, but based on the results that I'm aware of, they're still not quite at the level where they can reliably and consistently beat Blank. I think they can, be competitive enough to regularly scrim with Blank and take some maps off and all that kind of business. But to really beat Blank consistently is not something that they can do just yet. What I will say is, based on the current year's World Cup trials, you sort of made this note, Josh, that it's like all of Blank last year. This year, it's like a mixture of Blank, Sydney Drop Bears, and Dark-Sided. And what we are seeing is that, the answer to are they the best team overall is probably yes, but are they the best team in terms of do they cover every single best role? I think that would be a no, because you're seeing a lot more competition across every single role and coming in from individual players that are saying, actually, this guy is probably a better player in some ways, might be a better fit for a national team, because maybe he's the better player or because of some other reason than a certain Blank members, because a decent number of Blank members didn't actually make it through. So I think individually the teams are definitely, well, the players are definitely really, really catching up, and the teams are not that far behind.
Yeah, I think there's also another thing that's worth mentioning there, and that like the Australian teams, that have been playing in Contenders now for what would be coming up on 8 months, something like that, 6 to 8 months. They've really been pushing the envelope themselves as well. Like they are just a lot better in this time. The progression prior to that was a lot slower, a lot more gradual, and even then there were some like decent teams. Like there was a time where there were other Australian teams who were. I'm not going to name names, by the way, but like who were looking to go into OPC. How well they would have done is questionable, but certainly we would have predicted that they could at least not get relegated. If at least finish middle of the pack. So you have to also consider that, like, okay, let's say there's this theoretical situation where Blanca in Australian Contenders, with it as it exists now. Like let's say they're in Australian Contenders next season or something, and you've got all these other teams that have bettered themselves over these last 2 seasons of Australian Contenders. Like over the scope of a tournament, even though Blank may be beating these teams now, over the scope of a tournament, that can absolutely change, especially when you consider that these teams are pushing the envelope. So maybe even then Blank come in looking good and they finish top in their group, but by the time you make it to playoffs, the other teams have just tipped that balance enough with the extra month and a half of play, with all the other scrim time and all the tournament play that comes with that, and someone else wins a final. So like you can say that, like, in a vacuum on paper, yeah, right now Blank are the best team in Australia. But if you actually put them in a tournament, I don't know that they're guaranteed to win. I would still favor them to win, but you've got to look at the other factors of it being a tournament whereby other teams can and will try to beat you, especially when you come in as the team to beat.
Let's also consider that Blank has so far been, because they've been the leaders in Australia for some time, every other Australian team has kind of been a feeder team for them. Blank has like 12 academy teams they feed from, in a sense. I'm going to be honest, because when you look at who their members are made up, every single season they're like, okay, well, we lost this guy. Who do we get next? They look at the top Australian teams. We talked about Dark-Sided. 2 of the current members on Blank are from Dark-Sided. They've taken members from Sydney Drop Bears as well. Tongue, their support players from Sydney Drop Bears. So every single time Blank lose one of their players or something like that, or they want to bolster their squad, they look at the other Australian squads and they end up feeding from them. And to be quite honest with you, it's, a lot of players would really cherish that opportunity because A, you're going to a better team, quote unquote, and secondly, at least for the time being, you've been able to play on LAN in Pacific up until this season, obviously, which has been a pretty big deal. You're getting, a whole season's worth of professional LAN play against some very good teams. So plays are very
and you go international, which is important for these teams, like
Yeah, well,
especially
it's
these players.
technically,
Because there have been
international
players
wise,
out of Pacific that
or
get picked up
countries.
to thing like Overwatch League. So for like, if you're an Aussie player, actually that is a theoretical ticket in, arguably more so than AU may be right now. I think that's changing over time. I expect that to not be the case, in another year's time. But certainly that is how it has been for the last year. Like if you get the opportunity to go play in blank, you go play in blank.
So because of that reason, you have a case where a lot of the best talent, we talk about, okay, well, these guys might be in a better role or better player than some of the blank guys. You might have a case where, those guys just end up on blank at some stage as well, because that's the direction a lot of teams have been going. We'll see if that continues in the future, because there is a chance that, teams are saying, actually, we're getting close enough to blank that now if we just stick as a unit, we could potentially end up just beating them in the future.
So let's move away from being Australian apologists for a moment, and we'll talk about the other teams in the Contenders region. What were your expectations coming into this season of Contenders? Because I think you had a few new teams. You certainly had changes. It's been from my point of view as well. When I look at some of these results, they're very unexpected. We'll get on to the rise of Japan a little bit later. I really want to focus on that a little bit later in the podcast. But what were some of your big picture expectations coming into this season of Contenders?
If I can start with this one, I think I've always held the notion of I like it when a team betters their past result wholesale. And we have a couple of teams that have had a good history of doing that. Like Mega stick out to me as kind of the primary example of that. This is a roster that it's been changed somewhat, but it's also got a lot of the same core. And in spirit, I would say it's remained largely the same throughout its history. You look at season 1 of OPC as Fireball. I would argue they only avoided relegations because there were 2 Japanese teams in that tournament that were worse. And then they didn't squander that chance, right? Like they came back looking better in season 2, not quite good enough to make playoffs, but there was a time where maybe they could have. They never quite pushed to that point though. And then moving into season 1 of Contenders, they did make it into playoffs, and they in fact made it into semifinals. They had a hard match in the semifinals. They didn't make it any further than that point. So there's this very real progression. So at the top of the season, we're sort of, we came back to that story, readdressing it and going, well, on paper, the continuation is that now they make finals. Like, let's see whether or not that comes to fruition. So that's how that kind of history of the team, in my opinion, underpins the story. So big picture stuff that we were expecting was a lot of stuff regarding that. Same is true for Hong Kong Attitude. Similarly, they've been able to make it to a certain point and then never gone any further than there. That point has generally been a semifinal or some situation, whereupon they have then lost specifically to blank, which was actually a possibility this tournament by the time we made it to playoffs. In fact, neither of those 2 teams made it out of their quarterfinal. So again, it's how that history kind of underpins the tournament. And this has been the first season, I would say, where we have had the big departure from what has been the historical trends for a lot of these teams, bettering previous season results or that kind of stuff. And then you also have kind of fresh takes on certain elements with these teams. Like you got a team like Machi who were decent at the start of OPC, were one of the better teams, arguably, and then slowly petered out, didn't make playoff season 1, struggled their way through season 2, struggled their way through Contenders season 1. And at that point, I think the team went, look, this is obviously not working. Let's try something else. So they have come back in with a completely rebuilt roster, chock full of Koreans now. And they did get a better result. They got a better result than what they got in the past. They made it to quarterfinals where previously they had not. So we also looked right from the get-go at those teams that had rebuilt after last season based on the fact that they weren't doing as well as they wanted to. And there was this, is this going to work for these teams? In the case of Machi, I would argue both yes and no. But those have been the main things we've looked out for. And then, of course, the capstone to all that would be this kind of story of Japan. And again, it's an historically driven one. And for that reason has, in my opinion, been the most satisfying one to see play out, because this was the one where we did have that expectation. Mm-hmm. This is the good Japanese team. This is the one we've been waiting for the last year and a half. So that coming to fruition has been great to see, because if it hadn't, we would have looked like idiots.
Yeah, and sort of add on that as well, Hong Kong attitude and blank, like you sort of mentioned, they have this sort of history to live up to. So it was a little bit disappointing, especially in blank's regard, that they fell off as hard as they did. Now, technically, they finished in the same place as Hong Kong Attitude, which is quarterfinals, but getting there was just so hard for them. So the expectations overall going into season 2 was that, okay, this is probably blank season to win. Detonator Korea got in their way last season. They've had other teams like Ardian and Flash Wolves the season before in Pacific Championship. Now there shouldn't be anyone in the way, and then suddenly this whole logistics thing happens to them, and they're not playing on LAN anymore. And then it's like, okay, well, this is maybe their season done here. So that was a bit disappointing. Then going on top of the sort of Cyclops Athlete Gaming, the Japanese team coming in as well, we've had a lot of history of Japanese teams where they've just had very, very poor results. So I don't know, the expectation for them was, how far can they go? They're going to be able to make a middle of the pack appearance here, maybe sneak through to quarterfinals and make it further from there. But, pretty nice surprises they made it to the top.
I actually think there's one last thing. I don't know if this is necessarily like my expectations coming into the season, but this was certainly something I wanted to see play out. And there's no getting around this. Out of 12 teams in the so-called Pacific region, 5 were Korean. And I think there's always been this, I don't think, I know, there has always been this perception, I think, around the Pacific region of, of this quote unquote B tier Korean teams coming in and beating all the competition. Like, I'm going to be honest. Yeah, like Pacific is wholesale a bit weaker than Korea. That's probably true for every fucking region one way or another, right? Like, it's not a fair comparison to make in the first place. But more importantly, when you look at the teams that have actually done that, like come in and had their dominance, like the first one was Ardian, like part of that is now an Overwatch league and the rest of it is top tier contenders teams in other regions anyway. Like, that's not a fucking B tier team, right? That is top talent that beat everyone. If top talent isn't beating everyone, then what the hell is going wrong, right? So one thing I really wanted to see play out over the season, if only to silence the mouths, was what it actually looks like when you have a full spread of Korean talent and some genuine, in my opinion, quote unquote B-tier Korean teams in this tournament. And what we got was a situation where we could have had an all-Korean playoffs. We absolutely could have, but we didn't. And some of the Korean teams that lost in pretty spectacular fashion. We also had a team, New Paradigm, who, need I remind you, were entirely Korean, who absolutely bottomed out. That's what a B-tier Korean team looks like. Not Ardian, not Detonator Korea. Those are good teams, right? They deserve the wins. So it wasn't an expectation necessarily, but certainly at the top of this season, we, for the first time ever, actually had the chance to really answer some of those questions regarding, like, how good are these Korean players that come in? How good are these local teams? Like, what actually is the lay of the land here? Is there any merits to this idea of, these second-rate Korean teams can just come in and smash the competition? And I think now we've actually been able to answer pretty solidly no. And I think there is a specific example within there that I really like to note for those who are ever kind of wondering, and that is actually Matchy. So when I say earlier, did their rebuild do what they wanted it to do? Like, was it a success? Well, yes, they got a higher result, but also, I mean, no, right? Like if you could just pick up, any 6 Koreans and suddenly smash Pacific, then Matchy would have won this season. They didn't. They didn't get past their quarterfinal. They lost 3-0 to a Thai team that didn't make it past playoffs in season 1. Or didn't make it past quarters, rather, in season 1. So, like, if you've ever wanted to know how good or bad the Korean teams and the Korean players that come through these non-Korean regions truly are, here's your answer. If they're winning, it's because they are genuinely really good players. But most of them aren't. And the fact of the matter is, Korea does just have more players that are good than any other region. But it doesn't mean that the only good players are Korean, and it doesn't mean that all Korean players are good.
So when you were looking at these teams coming into it, the Korean teams, were there any that you identified as this should be the best team, or were all of the Korean teams fairly unknown? Because when I'm looking through them, I'm really unfamiliar with almost everybody, other than I think Talon eSports has Bazzi on him, on them, who used to play for Seven, who I know is a really good player. What's
That's
right?
a different Bazzi. That's a different
Oh,
Bazzi.
that's a different
Yeah,
Bazzi.
yeah.
Oh, fair enough.
Bazzi, you know, is
Multiple
still on
Bazzies.
Oh, he
seven.
still plays for Seven, of
Yeah,
course,
yeah.
so he couldn't play
Yeah.
both tournaments.
There's one
Just
that
a
we
name
did
stealer.
pin as being potentially good, and one that was a bit more of a known quantity, I would say, and that was Monster Shield Korea, who are We Love Gaming Korea, and if I'm not mistaken, similar to CAG insofar as I think they did actually qualify for season 1 of Contenders, but couldn't actually make it to play, so they were already
Okay.
good enough to do it then, and that was with like Detonator Korea in that same trials. They were good enough to do it this season as well. And then finished top of their group. They only actually lost to EXL. And like Group A was a close run thing, all things considered. That was the group with like literally all the Korean teams in it, and then also Mega. And then also now they're out in the semifinals. But that's sort of the one that came in as like the most known quantity, I would say.
I'd say no, they weren't a known quantity either. None of these Korean teams are really known quantities, to be quite honest with you. If you look at the history of the teams, basically came out of nowhere. It's different to Ardent and Detonator Korea, where for Ardent you had basically it was just Mighty AOD. It's like Mighty AOD plus a couple of new hot shots. And
Just
I mean,
for 1 second, I want to go on a tangent.
you're muted, by the way, Josh.
Oh no, I can see you're really
sorry.
excited about something.
Yeah, I want to go on a tangent for 1 second because people always underrate Ardian. I know exactly what you mean when you're saying that it's like, oh, some B tier team can come in and smash everybody. Like, people forget that these motherfuckers beat Kongdu Panthera just before they went to the finals and played against Lunatic High. They were literally in that unbelievable, the most ridiculous group of death we've ever had in Overwatch, with Rogue, fucking Lunatic High, Kongdu Panthera, and Mighty AOD, the team that then goes on to split into 2 parts and dominate another region. I mean, there's a world in which this was a top 10 approaching top 5 team.
I can tell we both really want to jump in here. You go, Kevin.
The thing is, Mighty AOD in that group, you could probably say if they were in a different group, they would have made it much further in that tournament. It's insane. You also look at their roster and you're like, this is where Fate and Kareev came from and all that kind of stuff. It's like Mighty AOD is a good team. Like, this is a strong team.
Yeah.
And people they go into Pacific under a new name called Ardent. And then Ardent goes back to Korea and went O2 Ardent. It's a totally different story. But they go to Pacific and people maybe don't make the connection. They just stop at the roster. They don't look at the players like, oh, Ardent, it must be a B Korean team. They don't look at the roster and say, oh, isn't this just Mighty AOD? Like, aren't they going to be insane? And they absolutely were insane, backed up by Coach Moon as well. All 3 of their coaches, like I said, ended up going into Overwatch League as coaches now.
And now they've moved over to China, the core of that team, and they've only lost 1 map the entire season over there as well.
And they won the last season. And they won the last season in China. So it's like people, I think a year later, most people will look at them and be like, okay, actually they were a good team. There's some people who will still look at them and be like, yeah, whatever. I didn't do my research. I'm going to say whatever anyway. But now I think more people can realize that. Look, Ardent were absolutely insane. You talk to people in the Overwatch League, like Gumba, who played against Ardent, who's now assistant coach at LA Valley, and he'll tell you just how absolutely insane Ardent were. Moon, of course, their coach as well, tell you the same thing. And then the other team for season 1 of Contenders, Detonator Korea, was still made up of players that had some Apex experience. You had Modern from Flashlux and Sleepy Bear from Combox Spirit. Then the rest of them, they all played together for 6 months already. And previous to that in Apex Challenger, and people were saying, oh, this is not a very good team. Look, this is just like, leftover Korean stuff. And to be quite honest, I was like, it's kind of true, but at the same time, people like, oh yeah, look at the results from 2017, blah, blah. And the problem I have with that is you're using results from so long ago to justify how good they are now. It's like people are not factoring in that teams can actually improve over time. And this is like 6-month-old results that people are using to say this is not a good team. And then didn't a Korea win, and people still don't respect that for some reason. They think this is not a good team, even though you have Apex level experience here. Doesn't matter that they weren't super good. You can meme Flashlux all you want, but they were still Apex level. Like, that's the fact. And then they won, and people are still looking at like, it's kind of whatever. But I think those teams need the respect. But going into this season, which is where we have Monster Shield and Town and all the rest,
just before you do, because
I did just have a point to finish up, and I'll let you.
Go ahead.
Is the fact that now for the first time in Contenders in the Pacific region, you do truly have Korean teams and players that are far more unknown, that don't have Apex experience, that don't have even Apex Challenger experience. They've kind of just come out of the woodwork, and they're still good, but they don't have that kind of quality to them.
And actually, because this kind of links back to what we were just talking about with both Arden and Detonator Korea, more so to the Detonator Korea side of things, right? Like for people who still can't wrap their head around this thing of like what? This team didn't win in a different place 6 months ago, and now they come back and they're winning. Oh, the place they're winning now must just be shit, right? Like I want to bring up a bit of a sort of left field example in Cyclops Athlete Gaming. A good significant number of these players were on the very Japanese teams that kind of earned them their much maligned reputation, where they just fucking bottomed out. Like they couldn't win for shit, right? And now they're coming in, they've made it to the finals. They look like they genuinely could win the thing and genuinely should win the thing. Like it's something we could have pinned from the get-go when we saw these players together on this team and how they were playing, right? If you can't wrap your head around the fact that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, the players can lose on one team and a number of them can reform, or hell, the entirety of them can reform, you know, under like a new name or like go and play in a different tournament or what have you, and be better than they were 6 months to a year ago, then I'm sorry, but like you're fucking stupid. Like who is gonna like it's just not even relevant. Like look at some of the, I mean, even across the entirety of Overwatch League, right? Like look at how teams did. It wasn't just like there is literally like every team finishes in the exact same fucking place each stage, right? We are well versed with the idea that teams can get better and worse over time, that teams can improve, that other teams cannot keep up at the same rate. If you can't do that when you're looking at contenders as well, then I really don't know what to tell you. Like, I don't think there's anything that can actually silence those people because they just don't get it.
It's you know, it's kind of goalpost shifting as well. It's if you need to stay consistent with logic. It's like if you want to use old results to say, well, this team must be bad now based on old results from 6 months ago, then most people would have to say, you know, oh look, I hate to kind of throw another team under the bus here, and you know, Dallas Fuel, right? It's like, oh, NBS are going to be the #1 team in the world, best team in Overwatch League, and unfortunately, and I do feel bad for them, and I'm sure they'll do better next season, but unfortunately, that just wasn't the case. And
I'm not sure
people
they'll
need
do
to
better next season.
I don't know. I'm just trying to. I gotta stay positive.
You're giving them the benefit of the doubt.
Positive about it. I'm not gonna. I don't want to
like
throw
it.
them under the bus. I'm using them as an example. I think that's enough throwing under the bus already. But the point is that people will use past results as an indication of present results, and that's fine. That's how predictions work, right? That's okay. But people need to understand, look, there is a big time gap here, and in that time, teams can get better or worse. Detonator Korea got much better. They won a region. That doesn't mean the rest of the region's bad. That means Detonator Korea got much better. Then you have another case where, look, MVS were very good, and then they weren't. So, you know, you have to be able to look at the past as a context, but then actually just look at the present and use that as the measuring stick.
Well, that's like the thing I always say is like past results give context, present results give information. You're stupid if you ignore either.
Sure, absolutely. So given that these teams, I want to dive into Group A a little bit. Because Group A, like you said, had a butt ton of Korean teams. Magic Esports, who are listed on over.gg as Taiwanese, because I assume the organization is actually a Korean team. Talon Esports, listed as Taiwanese, because I assume the organization is actually a Korean team. Excel and Monster Shield Korea, both Korean as well. New Paradigm, Korean. So this was a very non-Pacific Group A in some regards. But we've also had some weird results once we got to the playoffs. So how do you factor in the fact that Monster Shield, presumably, I mean, I'm making assumptions here. I didn't watch the group stages all too much. Monster Shield, on paper, looks like the best team in this group. But then Talon Esports came through and wrecked them once they got to the semifinals. So what's going on here in terms of the battle of the Korean teams?
So I want to give a bit of context here. Just like in the run up to playoffs, this group was an incredibly close run thing. Like when you consider, so there's a couple of factors at play here. First of all, Monster Shield Korea, who we did anticipate could well be the best team in this group. They turned out to be the best team in this group in terms of the final standings. They lost to EXL quite early on. Also, right the way down to the last week of play, Matchy had a match which they then won, which guaranteed them at least second seed. And then the remainder was going to be determined by Talon against Monster Shield Korea in the very final week of play. And the situation was as such that depending on the result and depending on the map score, we could have had a situation where Matchy were first seed, Talon was second seed, and Monster Shield Korea were third seed. We could have had... I believe it was technically possible maybe for Talon to also achieve that third seed. I might be misremembering that, but at any rate, that just goes to illustrate, right? Like that first seed, second seed, third seed stratification, especially between those three teams, doesn't really tell the whole story. That being said, it is actually still quite a surprise that only 1 week later Talon came back, having just lost to Monster Shield Korea,
Absolutely,
and then not just beat them, but beat them absolutely resoundingly. So, I think that context is quite important, because especially in the other quarterfinals where it was like a third seed beating a second seed, like it was with Talon taking out Hong Kong Attitude, like that is not the most unexpected result that can happen there. Like Talon could have been the first seed in their own right. And I think it also just goes to show actually how good Group B was as well, that they were also able to beat out, half of those teams altogether in both the quarters and then also the semis as well. Actually, not even the semis. It was only those two Korean teams, Monster Shield Korea and Talon, that made it into the semis. So I think it's actually given us a pretty interesting yardstick for all of these teams, right? Like we don't just have like the two good teams eyeing each other up across the bracket. Like we've got a lot of potentially quite good teams in this tournament. And we are slowly narrowing in on who's going to be the champion. It makes everything very hard to call. It makes everything very exciting.
I think the thing about Korean teams entering the Pacific region that's been sort of changing as time goes on is, in the past, we've had like a Korean team come through some sort of trials format, whether that be OPC Season 2 qualifiers, which Ardian absolutely smashed, which quite obviously, and then smashed the rest of the season quite convincingly as well. Dropped, I believe, only one map the entire season. I'll reiterate that. One map they dropped over the entire season. 2 round robins, by the way. And then you have Detonator Korea, who, definitely still dominated their way through most of the trials and all that. Came on through as the favorite team. They didn't quite dominate as hard. They kind of lost a few maps in there. Nearly dropped the grand final to Blank. In fact, Blank, in their eyes, and definitely how they feel, is they should have probably been able to win that. So that was actually very close grand finals. Whereas Ardian just completely. That's true. I don't want to make an excuse for Blank, but they did get
of course
grand final.
We're all Australian apologists here.
I don't want to sound like one, but it's
it's
close to my heart. Anyway, the point being here is that as we've moved through with Korean teams coming in, they've actually been less and less dominant every season. So Ardian were again so incredibly talented that no one could even touch them at all. Then Detonator Korea were very good. Teams were pretty much not really able to contest them, except for maybe the top teams like Hong Kong Attitude and definitely Blank. And then this season you have, again, the sort of trend of number 1 trial seed from trials, Monster Shield Korea. Looks like they're the best team. Goes through number 1 in their group after some hardship. They lost matches in there, they lost maps in there, then lost their semi-final to Talon eSports. So they are getting weaker as time goes on. The other thing that's my last little tidbit here from Talon eSports is, as if Mighty AOD wasn't, didn't have their fingers dirty enough, the coach of Talon is actually Arachne from Mighty AOD.
Excellent.
And actually, to add on to that one sentence you put there, the Korean teams are getting weaker and all the other teams are getting stronger, is I think important to mention there.
I'd say yes, but this season I think there's been, obviously with ping issues and Blank.
Yeah, this season has been.
I would say that would be an accurate
asterisk on that.
Up until last season, I would say that's a true aspect.
So let's dive into that one semi-final for a second. The Monster Shield against Talon eSports. What do you think were the defining features of this match to be able to turn it around from being a 3-1 about a week before this happened to a 3-0 for Talon eSports? Was it individual players that stepped up massively? Was it just the team ended up doing really well? Was there a patch change from then to playoffs, actually?
There was. Yes.
Right, yeah. That's happened across Contenders.
There's an interesting thing to note just with regards to the patch change. So I want to preface this by saying, look, I'm really into like the story and the narrative of Cyclops Athlete Gaming this season, but I have to say it was actually this semifinal between Monster Shield Korea and Talon that was my favorite semifinal, because it had my favorite sort of game, and that played out on like no better do you see this than on Control specifically. And this is my favorite sort of game. Like we've all seen games like this. Like all of us have at some point in our lives had the chance to cast games like this, and they're my favorite, where you get two teams that play the exact same team composition, and they're going so evenly, but one team is just eking out a little bit of an advantage. Like, you get the situation, this is what played out. The two teams, like, they come in, like, one team wins the opening fight and they get like maybe 20% progress on the point, then the other team comes in and wins the next fight and they get 20% progress, and so on and so forth. They're just kind of matching each other until one of the teams tips the balance, gets that subsequent fight win, and they end up closing out the map. And in every situation for that Lijiang Tower, it was Talon doing that. Also, it wasn't even percentages. Talon were always getting just a little bit more, and it was this true game of inches, right? You can look at every single metric that you would maybe want to look at in a game of Overwatch. They were getting ults up slightly faster. They were getting slightly more percentage. They were getting to the point slightly quicker, and that's relevant because both of the teams were playing GOATs. They were also just playing like old school, if you will, like pre-patch GOATs. That's a bit of a hairy thing. I don't want to unpack that too much, but they were basically playing stuff they'd played throughout the regular season, is my point there. Which is why it's really interesting that Talon then won it, where in the past they'd lost, right? Like, very rarely do you get such a direct comparison between two teams. I think the reason it turned around for Talon probably comes down to just like polishing all the brass knobs in the mansion that is their GOATs play. And then also everything else, right? They didn't only play GOATs across everything, right? They just polished everything, absolutely everything they could see to polish. And it totally showed. Like, there's a really excellent fight, the opening fight on Control Center. If you want just one example of this and how the entire series kind of went out, right? The two teams were just kind of brawling on the point as it was coming up on unlocking. Ult charges really close. Talon's Reinhardt player got his Earth Shatter slightly faster and just nailed the entirety of Monster Shield Korea. And it was absolutely incredible. So like, it was just those little bits. They were just that tiny bit tighter than Monster Shield Korea. Maybe that was an on the day thing. I like to think it was the practice they put in after losing to Monster Shield Korea. And also, when you lose to a team, you have a very known quantity, right? Like, you know exactly what you're coming up against. You know exactly what level you need to be at in order to beat them. And I really just think that's what happened for Talon.
The match was also close in the sense that, you know, a lot of it came down to very minute factors. I think it was definitely a game of inches. You see the result being a 3-0. There's actually a draw in there as well. And it doesn't really speak to the whole picture of the match itself. Like Pixie was sort of saying here, you know, very small factors change how the first map went in the Control Center because, well, Control, rather, as a game mode, you have two teams playing both GOATs. They're both just running each other, just slapping each other in the face with the tanks, which is just GOATs gameplay. It's, you know, it's a little Resident Sleeper to see just two GOATs comps just running at each other. But the thing that changes about who can actually get kills here is like, okay, does a Reinhardt charge another Reinhardt out of the way or get a charge kill on a player that insta-gives them? That's a changing factor. The other thing is who gets the first ultimate, because no one kills each other, right? You get two GOATs teams, the healing's too good, the HP's too good, you have no DPS, so you don't have good burst damage outside of like a charge. So you're both just slapping each other with wet fish until someone falls over. And the thing that changes things up is, you know, like Pixie saying here, Villeneuve got his Earth Shatter so quick, just by, when I say so quick, it was like 5% faster than Luke on the other side.
That's how close this was the whole way through.
And then you have on Night Market as well, you have the Zarya charge, the Graviton Surge coming up just slightly faster for Gogoro on the challenge side. He uses the first Graviton Surge, wins the fight. Then you have Monster Shield coming back in. Right, Monster Shield come in, and I believe VK was the Zarya player. Was him or Perfect? He uses then his Graviton Surge, then Monster Shield wins the fight. Then you have broken up in there. Eventually, there was a self-destruct kill or something like that that really swung things around. But the point is, it just came down to such minute factors, like 5% difference on an ult charge, swinging the fight so hard for one team, allowing them to then snowball. Because once you've won a team fight, you're getting more ult charge, you're farming the other team now, they're trying to catch up, and it just gets worse and worse for the other team. And that's just one map, right? The other two maps were definitely much more winnable. In fact, they were all winnable, but the other two maps in particular, especially the draw on Temple of Anubis, was the fact that, I mean, those were maps that Monster Shield Korea probably could have won, and then on one very penultimate fight, they just kind of lost it. They just kind of couldn't quite get it across the line, whereas you'd say that Lijiang was the map slowly sliding away from Monster Shield Korea because it was snowballing so hard for the other side. But on Eichenwalde and also Temple of Anubis, it was a lot more winnable for Monster Shield. They're doing so well. They're doing really, really, really well up until one point, and then it all turns to shit, and then they lose. So that's the unfortunate thing for Monster Shield. But they easily could have taken this series themselves 3-0. It was just so close. The margins were so close that Talon being the winner.
And it's like, I love those sorts of marginal games because, I mean, the fact of the matter is when you're leading by 5% in every single situation, eventually that, like, over time becomes one extra ultimate that your opponent doesn't get. And from memory, actually, there was only one place, and we did note this during the match, there was only one place where Talon was leading by more than just a couple of, like, a marginal percent. This is after we were off Lijiang Tower. This is on the later maps. And that was specifically with Gogora playing Zarya. Whenever Gogora was playing Zarya, whether it was Perfect or VK on Monster Shield Korea, because both did play the Zarya at various points, regardless as to who it was, Gogora always had significantly more uptime with Graviton, was charging it way, way quicker, to the point where, and like, this is, in the very first map on Lijiang Tower, we're talking like leading by 5% in any given situation, and mostly just like one gets one and the other gets the other. By the time we were on the last map, Gogora was getting 2 for every 1. That's the only place I would say Talon really started to get significantly ahead. But at the same time, I like Kevin kind of hit it on the head there. Like, in spite of that, these were still 2 extremely close run teams. But it was always in that moment that mattered the most. Monster Shield Korea weren't getting it through, weren't hitting the marks that they needed to, while Talon were consistently.
Just for the sake of accuracy, I just want to point out, it was Perfect playing the Zarya. I just went and checked because I was like, I got to get this right. Perfect was playing the Zarya, and a week was playing the Zarya as well, because Kagura was actually on the D.Va. But on the the non-Goats maps, it was Kagura then going on to play something like a Zarya, because a week.
And that's where you were getting those 2-for-1 type Graviton deals.
Yeah.
The value, bringing the savings to you.
So, Jesus, we've teased it all podcasts so far, but the biggest story for me of this entire season is Japan and the vindication of Japan. Because I'm going to set the scene. I'm not going to pull any punches. Japanese teams previously have just been shit cans. They have been garbage. They've just been the worst. Every time they were in a tournament, it was a free win. You knew they were going to get relegated. They were crap. They came out of the World Cup and they were like, oh man, these guys are like not actually straight garbage, easy wins. And it blew everyone's fucking mind. But now we have a team that is in the finals of the Pacific Division, with a team that really dominated their group stage by the look of it on paper, and have, yes, they've edged out their playoff games so far, but they do look like a solid contender for one of the best teams in the Pacific region. How the fuck has this happened? What has happened in Japan?
I'll start with the history, and then Pixie can give you the current goss, the standard that's happening right now. But as far as the history goes, look, if you don't know, first of all, there was another detonated team before Detonated Korea that was called Detonated Gold that played in the first season of OPC.
Fucking Detonated Bronze.
All right, thanks for that. But Detonated Gold, look, they were definitely better than that. But Detonated Gold came 7th out of 8 teams in OPC Season 1. The only teams they actually beat were the other Japanese team called Sun Sister. So there's 4 round robins. Detonator had 3 match wins, 3 of them versus Sun Sister. The only reason they didn't get 4 is because Sun Sister took 1 in the 4th round robin. So they only traded matches against each other. So that's kind of gives you a little bit of context first off. And then you had Libilant Supreme, and then Yoshimoto and Count. And I do want to speak towards last year's World Cup as well, because that's the first time you look at Japan and say, all right, these guys are pretty decent. These are definitely looking like potential contenders here. Like, they should do quite well. Very excited to see Libilant Supreme then play in OPC Season 2, because Jasper and Darton, the 2 tank players from 2017's World Cup, are on this Libilant Supreme squad. They go in and they bottom out again. This time worse than Gold.
Because they don't have another Japanese team to take wins off.
Well, that's partly true. They got 0 in 14 out of 2 round robins. They did not win a single match. Worst of all, they only won 1 map. 1-42 is their map record, which was very, very sad. And We haven't
It's
seen.
it's very difficult to do a reverse Ardeon, but they managed it and
Yeah,
made it
yeah,
even
yeah.
worse.
Oh my god.
And in the same
Um,
season as well.
And you also have a case now where actually Ardian lost 2 maps. So I just got to correct myself early there before someone online is going to nail me. But then you have going into last season, right? Like, okay, things are getting a little bit better. Oh, AKTM's back. This is great. He's the darling of the World Cup. You know, across all the World Cup stages, there's that one guy you remember. He's AKTM. Like, okay, I'm excited. Get to finally see him in action. He plays in Contenders season 1 of Pacific region, and then you have him on Yoshimoto and Count. Now, I don't want to. I'm highlighting him because he's the most well-known player, but to be quite honest with you, the team as a whole was just still not very good. Now, they did better than other Japanese teams, 1 and 4 in Group B, so they did beat the amateur, the other Thai team there. Basically, I'd say of the Thai teams, probably the one that was just slightly worse. So they did get that 1 and 4. They had a 7-12 map record, better than the other Japanese squads, but they still got relegated. And AKTM, to his credit, did very well. Like, he did a reasonable job. Didn't quite live up to the mythology that basically people had painted for him, which is in some ways a little unfair. I think by the time it's kind of like one of those Greek myths at one point. We're like, yeah, you saw the guy do well at one stage, then a year down the line, you have enough Chinese whispers, and he's basically at this stage like a myth, right? He's too good for, based on what people are saying, he's like he should be the best player in the world.
Yeah, I mean, dude had
obviously,
like one good match on McCree, right?
and then the myth just got out of hand, and like it's not his fault. He did really well, but he can't live up to that. There's no way a guy could ever live up to that mythology. So he doesn't do nearly as well in the Contender season. It's not really his fault that the team kind of bombed out, and now we are here. And the thing about this Cyclops Athlete Gaming squad is, first of all, it's got 2 members from last year's World Cup squad, which is Tayo and Claire, who are both insanely good players. Yoz, who was the Zenyatta player and one of the other very, very well-known players from last year, played in trials for CAG, but is no longer with the team. And then you have on the rest of the roster 3 members from that Detonator Gold squad that I talked about just before, who only won 3 matches over 4 round robins, and all 3 were against the other Japanese team. That Detonator Gold squad had Amakin, Sabagod, and Samarita, who are now at the World Cup, who are now in CAG and are some of the best players on that team. And then their coach, XQQ, was a player, not to be confused with XQC. By the way, XQQ was maybe perhaps a pro player before XQC, so he can keep that name. XQQ was playing on that Sun Sister squad back in April last year, so he was a pro player at that stage who went only with 1 match when against Detonator Gold, and now he's the head coach of CAG, head coach of Team Japan, and they're doing much better.
Is it fair to say that this was like a Japanese super team that they formed trying to come into this? Was this actually some of the best players on paper? Do you have any idea of like what the thought process was making this team?
I'm going to put in one thought here, which is to say pretty much yes, and because they look at it across. If you look at who the best players on Detonator Gold were, Amakin's definitely number 1. Samurai is very good as well. Sabagod only came in towards the end, and so you'll take them. If Japan says that they would rather play Sabagod than Yoz, I trust Japan, because Yoz was insane. And if you're going to replace Yoz with anybody, it better be a damn good player. So I trust Japan to make that decision correctly. And then for everyone else, you got Claire, who's got that kind of leadership with them. He was on the World Cup squad last year, very good player. And the rest of the players, sort of meshing together in that regard. Tayo and Amakin sharing some spots, and then this completely new guy out of left field who is who is an absolute monster, who I'm sure will play out of his mind coming this weekend. I hope so anyway, because I'm talking the crap out of him, and if he doesn't, I'm gonna be really sad. And people are gonna come to me like it's my fault. But look, it's not. If he doesn't play well, it's not on me. It's on him. But the point is, he's an absolute nut job. His name is Dep, D-E-P. He's in Widow main. He plays Trace and some other crap, but who cares? Widow main, right? That's his best. If he's on Widow, you're in trouble. That guy gets kills like insane. Like he kind of, his play style does remind me of Pine, because he'll do these long flanks. You're like, oh, this guy's feeding. He's going to get killed. He's going to get nothing done. Boom, 2 headshots, a 3rd headshot. You win the team fight. Like, how does he do that? That's what hopefully we will see. But if he doesn't do that, don't come at me.
The reality is as well, I think not only can you look at this and like you can have that sort of super team discussion. I think as well, it just goes to show, like, as with any team, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, right? And I feel bad because I feel like there's this implicit thing that goes on in all these discussions when we talk about CAG and like, you know, how on past teams, a lot of these players, like they were on like the worst teams in tournaments and stuff. It makes it seem like other players were holding them back and stuff like that. I don't know that that's necessarily the full story as well, but certainly those players that are now on this team were not in an environment where they could reach their full potential. And I think that's a number of things. Like when you cast your mind way back to you know, those seasons of OPC, like we weren't seeing a lot of McCree as being like a really strong pick at the time, but we also weren't necessarily seeing a lot of Farah. And like basically in among a lot of the stuff we weren't seeing, we actually have some of what is these guys' strongest heroes. You know, like Anakin's Farah is terrifying, and that's not his only good pick as well. But when we were seeing it like way back, like they favored it so much they were kind of forcing it, you know, and they were at least going to maps where, you know, it was somewhat reasonable to play a Farah. But it's like Farah at the time in the meta was nothing like what it is now. Like nowadays, if two teams are fielding a Farah, you're not like, lol, what? There's better work for them. Like maybe they're just that good. Like now you're like, yeah, this is where we see Farah. Awesome. So I think just the meta being where it is, and I see it kind of remaining this way for quite a long time. I don't mean like this exact meta is going to stay the same, but certainly we're not in that same kind of time, you know, like a year plus ago, where like sometimes a hero was almost like a joke if someone was actually picking them in a professional match. That not being the case has really helped these guys. Because they have diverse hero pools that are good enough as they are, but then the picks that they shine on specifically have at various points in their professional careers, and often the most visible points of their professional careers, not been the best picks in most situations, which has been unfortunate. But now that's not the situation. We're actually getting to see these guys not just show their depth on one hero and their skill on it, but also their breadth on playing a variety of heroes, because also there are a variety of extremely viable team compositions on the whole, and Cyclops Athlete Gaming, along with every team across any Contenders tournament right now that has made it to a semifinal, to a playoffs, has shown that they can play an incredibly wide amount of team compositions. There is no such thing as a one-trick team comp anymore. Not that I really think there ever was, but I digress. So that's been one factor leading to their current success, alongside this idea that like this is just the best players that Japan can field right now, and that's, you know, further reinforced by the fact that this is the exact same roster they're setting to the World Cup. Like Avril kind of said, they wouldn't be doing that if this weren't their best team. But also, there's probably a little bit of like, there's probably a bit of a feedback loop that does come with that, because it's like they're also doing really well in this tournament. Like maybe if they weren't, then the World Cup team might
and
look
also
a bit different.
You're practicing together all the time as well, right? So you get the added benefit of that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's the same thing as when Blank was basically the Australian World Cup team as well last year. It's like, well, you know, again, there's a bit of a feedback loop. It's the best Australian players, but also if they weren't playing that well, then they probably wouldn't be, like, maybe they'd be looking for other pickups, which is what's happened this year.
So let's go through this roster and identify the strengths of each individual player to get a feel for like what their style is as a team. So you were saying that Anakin has a really good fire, and McCree as well, right? Well, how would you describe this guy as a player?
Can I say good?
Yeah, sure. But I mean, what are his favorite heroes? What kind of style does he play within the team alongside Depp?
Let's add Genji in that pool as well, because that's probably his second most pick. Well, that's probably his number one pick in Farah second, I'd say.
If I can just jump like one more thing before we go too deep into this, is they do also have the 3 DPSs that they move between as well. So like, and there's good crossover as well. So like, if you're fielding Tayo and you're in a situation where you need to field a Farah, he can do so perfectly adequately. Like, you're not sore for not having Anakin. So it's not quite as cut and dry as like, oh, this guy's like this hero, and then you field this DPS for these 3 heroes. Like, there's enough crossover. It's just they then also got another level on some heroes where they do shine a bit more. And I would identify specifically that Farah and, as Kevin said, McCree there. Sorry, not McCree, Genji for Anakin.
More of the projectile player, you know, as people would.
Largely, yeah.
And then Depp,
but no slouch on hit scan.
Sure, okay. And then Depp tends to be on the Widowmaker most of the time. Is that how it works? Because the guy's just so good?
He's his Widowmaker, and then probably Tracer, and interestingly enough, Junkrat for some compositions, because he's like the main of the three DPSs, he's the one that doesn't get subbed out.
Yeah.
He either gets partnered with Anakin or Tayo, and
Okay.
those two sub out. And it's interesting, and I will be specifically interested to see if they continue this trend. But what you'll see is that how they decide to sub out their players is if they start with a control map first, it will be Dep and Anakin together. This is based on Contenders
Sure.
format and map pool. Then going into the hybrid map, which is map 2, that's when they bring in Tayo. Going into the assault map after that, then they keep Tayo in. Going into escort for map 4, they bring Anakin in. And if they make it to map 5, which they actually do a surprisingly high number of times, interesting talking point in and of itself, is if you make it to the 5th map, which is going to be control again, Anakin stays in. So it goes Anakin, Tayo, Tayo, Anakin. That's how they do the substitutions.
Okay.
And it's been that consistent the entire time that you can basically predict what it's going to be. So I will be interested to see if they do the exact same thing in the World Cup. And part of the reason for that is perhaps based on hero pools. The fact that Anakin does play a bunch of projectile picks, he doesn't play all of them. Like I mentioned, the Junkrat will go either to either Dep or Tayo for the most cases. I'm sure if he did stay on the roster during those maps, he'd maybe end up playing them. Dep himself actually does play a little bit of Hanzo, but not quite as much. Dep generally stays away from all the projectile picks except for Hanzo and Junkrat, and then he'll play the Tracer, McCree. I'm sure if Soldier was in the meta, he'd be playing a Soldier as well. But mainly the Widowmaker. That's the one that's really scary. If you will normally see, look, if they're not doing well, he's playing Tracer, he's playing Junkrat. They might not be doing well because they don't have that crazy, insane carry potential. He swaps onto a Widowmaker, and then they'll just start winning. That's it.
It sounds like this team doesn't play a lot of goats then as well. Do they prefer kind of fast, mobile, carry kind of compositions?
I'd say they're favored to play that. I'd say in Goats, Dep would be forced onto something like a Zarya. And it would be okay, but this team would rather counter Goats than play it. They'd rather play Anakin on the fire and say, you want to play Goats? We're going to play fire and Junkrat. You're going to get Dep Junkrat, Anakin fire. We're going to counter you instead of playing it into you. That's their style.
And they've never had any need to play Ghosts. Like I guarantee you, if they had to, they could. And like if they lost, it would still be like a close run kind of thing. It's probably in their repertoire somewhere, but there's just been no need to play it in the first place. Like it's like any team, right? Like if you can, for the teams that do play a whole ton of goats, it's like if you could play this, you could play it really well. Then like do that. Like just play what you're going to be strongest at. Don't one trick yourself. Don't be like all in on this one particular team comp. Have a bit of diversity, and I think that's been a strength here of CAG is they do have that diversity, as we were just talking about with how they can kind of vary their DPS picks and even just the flexibility of the players beyond that. Like I know we haven't actually mentioned it that much, but you do get that same level of flexibility just in general across their tank and support pools as you tend to these days. But that's really what it comes down to. Yeah, like Kevin said, they would rather counter Goats than play it because that works better for them.
How does their tank line look then? It's Samurai ID and Kenmo Horororo.
That's a
great name to say, by the way.
It's a hunting in the middle of fight. Say Ken Mohororo.
That's a great pronunciation.
We gotta say it slow so we don't run over it. You gotta say it's just Ken Mohororo. It doesn't matter how fast the fight is.
Just Ken.
Something Ken Mohororo, and then you go again.
I think I called him Ken once the entire season.
That would have been my go-to the whole time, just K-Dog or something, Like you're really shorting it down. So
Matt saves that one for me on cast.
Yes. What is their tank line like then? Are they a strength of the team as well as the DPS?
I'll start by saying that Samurai is definitely the more experienced. Kemo Hororo kind of came in with CAG. He doesn't quite have the same legacy as some of the other players on the team, and you definitely think where you'll really see Kemo Hororo is more in the I'd say more defensive style of play, where if he's protecting Anakin well and protecting Dep well, who are kind of the more pillars of the team that are gonna be the ones that'll win you fights, you'll see him more doing his job. To me, he feels more of a supportive player than too much of an in-your-face player. I could be wrong about that. He might not do that in the World Cup. It depends on what they're facing up against, and maybe if they get really desperate against Korea or something, they might have to swap up their playstyle.
Primarily like a diva player, then presumably, if he
is primarily a diva player.
Style.
More primarily a diva player. Samurai is primarily a Winston player. Gumba from LA Valiant called him at the time, and I'd still agree with this, as current now is the best Winston in Japan. So he's been a pretty big factor in the team as well. He's actually been playing a lot of Reinhardt this season. I think definitely because Goats is more in fashion in terms of meta,
Sure,
and
yeah.
Reinhardt definitely has a lot more of a
with
place
that,
in the
Ken
meta.
Mahororo feels there's Zarya. It's worth mentioning.
Yes, that's correct. And so those two working together has been pretty good. They've been playing together now in this team, I believe, for the duration of this team. It's always been those two together. So, they're more, I'd say more so, the non-DPS players in this team definitely feel more supportive than, say, other teams where you might have a star tank player where this guy is your definite playmaker, whereas the playmaking comes from the DPSs in a more traditional sense, so that the other members on the team, including the tank line, definitely feel a lot more supportive in the sense that they're there to make space, to protect, to peel, and to really push and allow the DPS players to get their job done. And then the tanks will have done their job. That's not to say they won't make plays, but I think you'll definitely be looking more towards their DPSs, and the tanks will be enabling their DPSs.
You did say as well that Sabagod had big shoes to fill. What's been your feel of Sabagod and Claire as a support duo?
Sabagod has been, the thing about Zenyatta's is, and Sabagod is the flex tank, the flex support player, is that, look, Yoz had a lot of damage output. Like, we don't have stats on damage or anything, so you just kind of look at, okay, how much is he contributing in terms of kills? How much is he assisting, his discording targets and all that? And that was a lot of what I was watching out from Sabagod. And I think definitely towards the end of the season, specifically in playoffs as well, you'll notice the amount of kills he gets is actually quite comparable. It's not just solely coming out of dip all the time or anything like that. Sabagod's definitely contributing a lot to the damage, especially on the Zenyatta. And I think different plays towards their playstyle as well, because Claire's mainly onto the Mercy still, because they like to play a lot of pharmacy. You're going to see a lot of Mercy in there. So Sabagod is generally playing the Zenyatta, and I'd say if Sabagod wasn't on the Zenyatta, you might start to see them kind of perhaps struggle a bit more on that support line. Obviously, the new support changes aren't in either, so it's not like he's forced off Zenyatta just yet. Zenyatta is still just a good enough pick, such a staple pick that Sabagod will likely be able to play it for the duration of the World Cup, so that'll be really good for him. And then for Claire as well, mainly onto the Mercy. Did see a little bit of Lucio, but Mercy's been his go-to, and he's had a very strong supportive role on that Mercy as well. And he is specifically looking for supporting those DPSs and putting the damage through those DPSs. Specifically, if he's damage boosting Dip on the Widowmaker, Dip's getting kills.
Their run throughout the tournament so far has been very impressive. But something you said earlier, Pixie, is that you kind of expected it, or like you had a hint of it early on. Well, why was that the case? Was that just because in their first matches they started winning and you were like, holy shit, this isn't a normal Japanese team?
We pinned it well from before that. The thing you've actually got to note is this team technically qualified for season 1 of Contenders as well. Like they've and I mentioned this before with regards to, I believe it was WLG. Like that was the qualifiers that saw Detonator Korea coming into the tournament. Like that's the sort of competition that was in that particular trials. And unfortunately, they weren't actually able to field the roster because of the land situation. Now that that's not the case, they can field the roster. And I mean, it's more just looking at the players. Like we'd seen Detonator Gold back in the day, and we looked at the 3 players of this team that were on that roster, and you go like, yep, like if I were to take the 3 best players from that team, it would be these guys. And then also, okay, you've got this guy from the World Cup, you've got this guy from you can look across all of them and go like, yeah, like the individual talent certainly appears to be here more so than it ever has been in the past for the Japanese teams. And that even includes Yoshimoto and Count, whereas Kevin was saying earlier, like you did actually have some of those World Cup players, but you didn't have all of them, and you didn't have the rest of that. Yeah, well, exactly. Like you didn't have the rest of that, right? I think if we were just looking at a team that was still only the best 3 players from Detonator Gold and then 3 other players, they wouldn't be doing as well. Like it wasn't hard to pin this one from the start. You just had to really be paying attention to who has been good in the past on these Japanese teams that have lost. And then when you put it all in one place, it's like, okay, if nothing else, now if they bottom out, it's because Japan sucks wholesale.
Yes, okay.
Right?
Yeah. This was the big experiment.
Yeah, exactly. And we've always been saying as well, like every time these Japanese teams have lost, we've gone, look, this isn't the best roster that could possibly come out of Japan. This is still not it. Every single time we've said that, when after the first two teams went out, we got Libland in season 2 of OPC, went, this is still not the best one. Maybe they'll do well, maybe they won't, but whatever, this is still not the potential best one. And I think the fact that all the teams had bottomed out meant that now when we finally did get the best one in, they had a lot to, I don't want to say a lot to answer for, but they kind of had a lot of, if you will, bad press to undo.
Absolutely.
I think if any of those other teams had have at least been finishing like middle of the pack, then you would have come in and said, this is the best one to date. The other ones have been middle of the pack. Therefore, this one is almost guaranteed to make playoffs. Because they didn't quite have that, there wasn't that same thought that they were guaranteed, but certainly there was the same aptitude. And, anyone who's been paying attention could kind of pin that from the start.
But there's no way that you would predict them to go unbeaten in the group, right? Because all the rest of them have been so bad.
No, certainly not. And that's the thing, is like, we're also well aware that, like, look, pretty much no one has watched the entirety of Pacific. And even then the people that do, like, we're not expecting them to go like rooting through the Japan scene to check out who's hot over there that isn't playing in Pacific Contenders or OPC. Like, we've been very clear from the get-go with this team, like, this is the best looking one yet. We are expecting good things. And then on their very first match, beating out Blank really just set the tone. It turned out that Blank had other issues. Like, they lost for things unrelated to the fact that Cyclops Athlete Gaming are really, really good. I think if Blank were at their peak, maybe CAG wouldn't have won that, and maybe they'd not be where they're at now, or maybe they'd be in the finals against Blank, actually. But that, like, the potential in this team from the get-go, combined with that opening match, which just kind of made a splash. It was like, finally, this thing we've been talking about is here, right? This is not new team, same Japan. Like, throw out the old book. This is volume 2. Like, this is the New Testament.
Volume 5.
This is volume 5. Yeah, like, this is now Japan. This is how good they are. This is what you should be expecting from them when they're playing internationally. For now, that's only when they're fielding this roster. But I think, like with every nation that's come into Pacific with like one good roster, eventually the other talent has started to come in there. Like, that's what happened with Mega. There was the one good Thai roster, and now Xavier have started to really push the envelope. And now there's more than one. And I like to think that thanks to this, at long last, in like a year, maybe 2 years, it will be very much possible for multiple Japanese teams to be quite threatening. I still think there'll be the one that is above them all, and that will likely be Cyclops Athlete Gaming, unless they split apart or something else happens. But this has kind of paved the way for these Japanese teams at last.
Yeah, it's a great thing for Japan to not just be like the worst team or the worst nation in the region. They've proven that they can do it. In terms of your expectations, with how Group A and Group B stacked up, looking at it and looking at the underperformance of a couple of teams in Group B, and then Cyclops Gaming going on this unbeaten streak, it seems from the outside that the conclusion to make would be that Group A was probably the stronger of the two. When you're using the eye test and actually watching these teams and analyzing them, does that seem fair? If you ignore how the playoffs actually went out, where it seems very even between the two groups, what was your feel of how the two groups stacked up?
Personally, I felt all of Group A that made it through, with maybe the exception of EXL, had semifinal potential. And the only reason I would put EXL as a maybe to that is, like, every team in Group A had the time where they looked like they were going to be the best team out of the group. EXL's one came the earliest and ended the first. So like, since then, every other team has kind of had that time. EXL weren't really looking quite like that team towards the later weeks of the competition. So yeah, CAG was very, very easy to say, is like, look, for all the strength in Group A, CAG are good enough that they ought to be, at least taking it to these teams. Potentially Hong Kong Attitude can. As for Xavier, this is a bit interesting, because before the last week of play, it looked like basically all of Group A going into the playoffs was good. And the top half of the Group B teams going into the playoffs were good and could make a semifinal, and that didn't include Xavier or Blank. But then in that last little bit of play, Xavier just fucking came alive. Like, there's no other way to put that. Like, they hit a stride, and they were running what we've kind of started referring to as like pseudo goats, or for the pun name, goats in the shell is what I like to call it, where they kind of have the bones of goats, but then they flex Patapan in and out across all sorts of different heroes situation depending. So you lose a little bit of the strength of goats as it exists in its usual form in exchange for having a little bit more flexibility. And it was just something that worked for this team. It was fucking dynamite for them. So when they won their quarterfinal, I wasn't too surprised. Like, I was a little bit surprised. I was more surprised that it was a 3-0. Arguably a 2-0, but that's beside the point. But I certainly wasn't surprised that they won, because by the time they got there, again, the eyeball test was kind of telling us that this is at least a team with potential to make it out of their quarter, to make it into a semifinal. And because they then did so in such convincing fashion, as they came into their semifinal, it's like, this team could do it. They could totally beat CAG here. Like, this is no longer the team that finished third in their group. This is a much better team than that. And in a regard, I think it's fair to say they were maybe weighed down by the results of their first couple of weeks, which weren't even bad results necessarily. They just weren't as good as the two teams that finished above them.
I would say, for me, Group A definitely looked like the stronger group. Results would say as well, they were trading much more evenly. Everyone, in general, I'm not just talking about, okay, the one or two teams. I'm saying the group in general, outside of Mega Esports, who had a really tough time, and maybe even outside of New Paradigm, who themselves were in a bit of a tough spot. The rest of that group looked very secure. You could have swapped out that entire top four for any. You could have rearranged that top four any which way you like, and I think it would have still been, a very convincing quarterfinals for every single team. Now, the difference there is you have a sort of quarterfinals case where EXL very narrowly lost to Cyclops Athlete Gaming. They went down to map 5 on the third stage of that map 5, which was Control, which ended up being Gardens of Oasis. And then CAG kind of just edged them out. But I think there was a real threat that EXL was going to win that. And then going on to the Marchi Xavier side of things, Marchi ended up having to forfeit a map in there. There were some issues with their ability to get into the match on time, so sad for them. But the other two maps that Xavier won were very convincing. Now, I'm not too sure for Marchi what the case was there, because, look, Xavier are a very good team, but I think Marchi severely underperformed based on how they played in the regular season. Marchi played much worse than expected. Xavier played to expectation and maybe even a little bit better. But there was a real case where there was potential for all four teams from that quarterfinals going to semis as Korean teams. Like, every single Korean team from Group A winning their quarterfinals match. It was absolutely possible. And when you saw Talon Esports beat Hong Kong Attitude, you start to believe it was more than just a possibility, maybe even a potential expectation. But both CAG and Xavier rose to the occasion, rose above the other two Korean squads. And, they made it to the semifinals, and now we have a Korea versus Japan grand final.
Yeah.
So based on what we saw from, the group stage, A looked better, but I'm really, really happy to see that CAG and Xavier sort of beat the other teams on the Korean side and came out really strong as well.
I would just speak to the other side of that very briefly, though, because I think we looked at all those quarters going like, yeah, it is very, like, it is a real possibility that it's just the Korean teams that win every single one of these. But I think we also did look at it and very fairly say, but there is also a possibility that no Korean teams go through here. I certainly felt like the less likely situation. And when you kind of average the two out, like, you get a situation where probably some Korean teams make it and some don't. And like, for the first time, I think, ever in covering this region, when I said, maybe it's all these other teams that make it through, I wasn't just saying that, like, there did still feel, unlikely as it may have seemed, there did still seem to be a possibility that, look, maybe blank come alive in the playoffs, like maybe the patch change, plus having Dragon Breath in for 2 weeks rather than just the one, like maybe they could still come alive. It was easily going to be the most unlikely to be upset, but it was still a possibility. And then as you move further and further down, I mean, it's, Hong Kong Attitude Talon was a second seed versus a third seed. Again, the win of the third seed wasn't unexpected, but it also wouldn't have been necessarily unexpected if Hong Kong Attitude had have won it. And really, every single one of those falls the same way. The only results that ended up feeling unexpected, I would argue that CAG having a close match felt like it was an unexpected thing. I
Yeah,
maybe
yeah.
thought they were going to get something a bit more one-sided, but also wasn't totally unprecedented. Again, when you consider that for a time, EXL could well have been the team that came out first seed out of that group. Arguably, that would put them on par with CAG. And then the other one that's more unexpected is Xavier Matchy being as one-sided as it was once the game was underway. But even then, look, even if Matchy had have like really showed up and they hadn't had the issue getting into the first game or any of that stuff, and they'd played to the usual level, I think there was still a world in which Xavier would have won. So I think we could have had either of those two like extremes of like all Group A in semis, all Group B in semis, and the fact that we got something that was a little bit in between with all the kind of dramatic results that we got throughout that wasn't too unexpected.
With CAG winning 3-2 over EXL, who you said were dipping towards the end of the season and weren't quite expected to have such a close game against them, and then they had a 3-2 game against Xavier as well. This makes it look like the odds are going to be stacked against them a little bit to be able to take down Talon eSports. What are your expectations for the finals? Do you think that Japan will be able to do it?
My expectation is they get to the bottom of Oasis and win on Gardens.
Honestly, based on how they've been doing so far, it's possible. What is it with Japan and going to Gardens, right? At least they're starting to win Gardens. The thing is, Japan and CAG so far, the really concerning thing is it does feel that they've kind of scraped through. As proud as I am of them for these wins, it does feel like they've kind of scraped through on these wins. 3-2 versus EXL, 3-2 versus Xavier, both finishing on Oasis Gardens on the very final stage as well. I'd say going into the match versus Talon eSports, there is a good shot that Talon just still beat them, because Talon, if you look at their path through the entire season and then into the playoffs as well, the 3-0 versus Monster Shield is very telling. Although that was a close game, to be quite honest, that could have also been Monster Shield. But I think Talon eSports, the fact that they did win 3-0, it still was their series going into it. And by the time we got to Gibraltar, which was map number 4, Talon were just that much better than Monster Shield. I think Monster Shield were kind of done by then. They just teetered out. They ran out of juice. So for CAG versus Talon, CAG would have to be far more consistent in their ability to close out games, because I think if they don't, Talon will be able to take that grand final. I would say that as much as I like CAG, Talon to me feel just that much more consistent, feel that just that much more favored, and CAG would have to be able to, push one step further and finish games they're meant to win, and then we wouldn't have a case of 3-2 where CAG have to clutch through in the final seconds. And what we see from CAG and Team Japan in just this weekend in South Korea in their group is, can they make those changes in time? Are they going to be good enough to get out of the group in South Korea? Because if they can do that, then I think they'd be the favorites for the grand final in Bangkok as well.
And I think that's actually an interesting, weird boon for this team, is actually that the entire roster gets to play that. It's almost like a kind of practice.
Yeah, definitely it is.
And also, I mean, even if that weren't there, I think I think Kevin very accurately brought up what needs to change for us to feel like this team is favored. It doesn't mean to say that right now they're going and looking like they can't win it. But certainly if we want to look at them as favored, they do need to fix those things up. But what they have is the time to do that. And I think that's actually a real important thing to note. For Talon, they've kind of hit this new level. I would definitely say that. And they will be preparing against CAG. But you get those sort of situations where it's just ever so slightly more unclear. When your team barely scraped through and you can look at what you did wrong, there's very clear things to go away and fix. When your team 3-0s, you'll still notice things that you wanted to fix for sure, but it's ever so slightly less clear. And because there's that extra bit of time, that could make all the difference here. It could also be that time is what makes the difference for Talon, and they're able to push even further beyond how good they looked against Monster Shield Korea.
Sure, yeah.
You really can't say.
Now, what are you to end this podcast? What are your expectations for Cyclops Athlete Gaming when they play as Team Japan in the World Cup, which is coming? When are the first games of that? I think that's in 2 days or something. Is it literally tomorrow?
Tomorrow.
It's tomorrow. It's Thursday for us, so it's tomorrow for us.
Okay.
Yeah, it would be tomorrow for you. It'd be tomorrow for the whole world. Yeah,
it's actually
That's
tomorrow comes.
That's how time works. Yeah.
So
we don't get more.
I believe they need to make top 2, right? All you have to. It's a slightly different format this year. There aren't 2 groups. It's just 6 teams, and I think it's a round robin, right? And you just have to be the top 2 teams. So they would essentially, if we assume that South Korea are unupsettable, which seems like a fairly decent, bar to set given their
That'd be
performance
fair
in
to
previous
say.
World Cups, they would have to upset Russia or Finland essentially because
Yeah.
they'd be expected to beat Taiwan and Hong Kong. Yes. So how do you think they'll match up against those two teams? Do they have genuine upset potential here?
I'll start first by saying that beating Hong Kong and Taiwan is absolutely expected. It feels bad to say that Taiwan and Hong Kong are not going to do well, but the fact is, they're going to come in with very split up rosters. If Hong Kong came in, if all of Hong Kong Attitude were Hong Kong nationals, and they could feel that squad, I feel a lot more confident. But because Hong Kong and Taiwan are just split 50-50 kind of teams, and those 50-50 teams of the 4 teams themselves are already kind of middle of the pack in Pacific, with the exception of Hong Kong Attitude, I don't have a lot of confidence in them, but they'll do as well as they can. Japan, on the other hand, Josh, you're right. They have to be able to upset either Finland or Russia because I just don't see them beating South Korea. Japan, like, if maybe Japan were like absolutely blowing every team in the Pacific out of the water, they were winning 3-0, 3-0 back-to-back clean in their quarters and semis, I'd be like, wow, maybe Japan can really compete with South Korea. Maybe not even beat them, but push them to the later maps in the series, something like that. But I don't have that confidence in Japan just yet because they don't win clean. They need to win super clean. So really, it's between, first of all, their first hurdle is Russia. Now, from what I know about Russia, you're looking at their team. It's 2 Overwatch League players, Shadowburn and Mistakes, and then you have 4 members from Windstrike who used to be CIS Hope. So it's mostly CIS Hope mixed with a couple of Overwatch League players. From what I can tell, this is still a very good team, and it would depend on their preparation. How much practice has Russia had in? This is a squad that they wouldn't have perhaps had too much time to work together aside from the 4 Windstrike members going in. So if they're underprepared, I think Japan can overtake them because Japan have the full CAG squad. They've been playing as a full CAG squad for a long time, a whole season of contenders up until the grand finals. That's where Japan could maybe edge them out. But the issue of consistency for Japan is still underlying there for me. Moving on to the harder competition, you have Finland, which is like what all Overwatch League minus Davin, who's Giganti, and then that's a bit harder. I think Finland just have the kind of skill level to shut down basically everyone else. You'd be crazy if you didn't favor South Korea and Finland to be the top 2 teams in that group. But Japan, can they beat Finland? If they can strongly beat Russia, who they play first, the first day of competition, their opening match is against Russia. If they do well against Russia, and when I say do well, I mean they win, and it looks good, it's clean. It doesn't have to be a 3-0 or 4-0, whatever it is, but it's like when they win, it's good. It looks good when they win. They're not just scraping through like they are sometimes. Then I'm like, okay, now they can really do well against Finland. And also Finland would need to look like okay, but if Finland are crazy as well, then maybe Japan don't make it.
It's like the reality of that group is like it's probably South Korea and Finland, and maybe instead of Finland, it's Russia or Japan. It's definitely not Hong Kong or Chinese Taipei, that I can say with some confidence. So I think that kind of tells you the whole story there. Like, can Japan do it? Well, they can't not do it. Like, they're not one of those teams that definitely can't do it, but that doesn't mean they can do it. It's a big maybe, and I feel like it's actually more dependent on whether or not Finland are unupsettable than it is to do with Japan. Like, first of all, Finland needs to be beatable. Yeah. First of all, Finland needs to be beatable. And then if they are, it could actually still be Russia that does it, because I think, like you said, Kevin, Japan would still need to, in my honest opinion, overcome Russia. Like, they're still arguably the underdog in that respect. But maybe game day comes and actually it turns out they're not. Maybe it turns out that with the wealth of this extra season of play with this exact roster that Russia hasn't necessarily had, maybe they are the better of the 2 teams. And then if Finland struggle, it's Japan that takes it. It's hard to say.
You look on paper and you think Japan is Russia here is definitely beatable for Japan. You'd go in and say, if you're going to put your money down, you'd say, okay, probably Russia here, just based on history. But also at the same time, you're thinking like, well, I'm not going to put too much money. I'm going to put a little bit of money down because I'm also not that confident either. Yeah, because there's there's a real chance here, and that is not even just a chance. It's like I wouldn't even say it'd be an upset. I think Japan being Russia would be kind of within expectations possibly. I think either of those 2 teams could be beating each other. It's those 2 right now in a mix for third place, and then the winner, the best team between those two, really pushing to get over Finland. So there's also a world where I see Russia, if Russia come in very underprepared, which is a possibility, then they might even lose to a better prepared team like Taiwan, who still have 6 Contenders members, and Taiwan could still be a slightly better team than Russia if Russia just come in very underprepared, Taiwan come in super prepared, and Japan's still better than them both. And I think the same could be true for, say, Finland, where Finland still a team made up of members from all over the show. I mean, like 4 or 5 teams represented on this roster. If they are not synergized, if they are not playing together like a really cooperative, solidified unit, just a really consolidated unit, I think Finland could be in trouble as well. So Japan's biggest strength is they're extremely unified. They just need to be able to get some cleaner wins and some more convincing wins. But I don't have any questions regarding their unit as a team. It's all members of CAG. They're very well practiced together. They know each other very well. I'd say based on that, they'd have a very good shot.
The dark horse of the group for sure. It's going to be incredibly difficult, I think, because you do have 3 teams that are stacked full of talent there, as well as Japan. But it will be very interesting to see, because even if they don't make it but still have like a major upset over Russia or Finland, that's going to do wonders for the people's interest in Japan, people's respect for the region, that kind of thing. So I'm really excited actually to see how this World Cup plays out. And I didn't think in a million years I would be excited for Team Japan at a World Cup.
Can I point out a matchup
Pacific.
here?
Sure.
I want to say, look, I pray to God Depp really shows up here, because I spent the whole podcast talking to Skype. He's amazing.
You want to see him trash Taimu?
If he loses, it's all your fault.
No, not Taimu. Not Taimu. Would Linksa be sniping over Taimu? I'm sure Linksa would be widowing over Taimu, right?
Maybe.
Surely.
Yeah. I'm not sure actually, because what would Taimu? I actually
Fuck,
don't have a clue how they're gonna do that.
I want to see Depp shit on both.
Just shit on
right?
all.
Like, what better way to make an impression?
One of the best matchups last year was AKT and McCree versus Taimu McCree, right? That was one of the most looked forward to, talked about matches. I want to see Depp on Widowmaker versus either of those two, maybe both, right?
At the same time.
And then and then above that, the next one is Depp versus Carpe, or Depp versus, if Sabiolbi maybe snipes. But I foresee Carpe sniping over Sabiolbi.
Absolutely.
So Depp versus Carpe is another one I want to see, because here, let me put this out there. If Depp really plays well against Carpe, people are going to be talking about Depp.
Yeah, absolutely.
That name's going to stick.
It's going to go down in history.
I want to see this guy push forward and maybe, be the first Japanese representative in Overwatch League or something like that one day. And this could be his path to doing that.
Well, thank you very much for joining me, both of you. Absolute experts. We've gone on for a long time, but hopefully that's been really interesting for people, because we did cover a bit of like the World Cup stuff and the whole rise of Cyclops. So I think there was a lot to unpack there in the Pacific region, but it's a lot of fun. So I would recommend checking it out. And thank you again for joining me, and we'll catch you next time. I think the next one I'm going to do is Australia as well. So we might even see one of you on. See ya.